Welcome and good evening. We're so glad to have you join us this evening for our 20th annual One City, One Story. This event is supported by our founding sponsors, the Friends of the Pasadena Public Library, and our community sponsor, the Pasadena Literary Alliance, Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. I'm Tim McDonald, Acting Director of the Pasadena Public Library, and we're so glad to have you join us tonight. 2022 marks the 20th year celebrating Pasadena's One City, One Story program, which is designed to broaden and deepen an appreciation of reading and literature to promote tolerance and understanding of differing points of view by recommending a compelling book that engages the community in conversation. A 14-member selection committee worked for many months to come up with 9 finalists, and they were all thought-provoking selections. Once again this year, we've not just one, but 2 One City, One Story selections, which we'll extend to the community in a celebration throughout the year. The 2022 One City, One Story selection that we're celebrating this evening, In the Country of Women by author Susan Straight, and the 2022 One City, One Story Summer Edition selection, Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between by Eric Nussbaum. In the Country of Women, which we'll explore tonight, is a valuable social history and a personal narrative that reads like a love song to America, California, and the indomitable women in the amazing family of our featured author tonight, Susan Straight. I would especially like to extend our thanks to the One City, One Story founding sponsors, the Friends of the Pasadena Public Library, and our community sponsors, the Pasadena Literary Alliance. Also the Library Commission, who came up with the idea of hosting One City, One Story 20 years ago. This year culminates the anniversary of this groundbreaking program. The Library Commission continues to be a wonderful supporter of the library, its programs and services, and I'd like to extend a thanks to those members. Chair Robert Karatsu, Adrian Bass, Judith Blanton, Chelsea Dickerson, Jordan Hutkin, Bo Patadian, Leslie Rosenthal, and Michael Stammer. This year's One City, One Story selection committee spent many months reading and reviewing numerous book selections before choosing this year's selections. I'd like to thank and recognize members of that committee too. Sharon Calkin, Rosemary Choate, Sally Kauser, Brooke Larson-Garlock, Roberta Martinez, Natalie Park, Michelle Pereira, Susan Porras, Dr. Aisha Randall, Christine Reeder, Maggie Reyes Rothner, Mary Schuler, founding committee member from 20 years ago, Larry Wilson, and finally, Jolly Erner, who was also a founding co-member of this selection committee 20 years ago. And Jolly passed away on February 26th this year, and we remember her tonight during tonight's program. Jolly was a lifelong teacher and reader, and her enthusiasm for One City, One Story inspired all of us, so we remember her tonight. And now, let me tell you a little bit about our author this evening. Susan Straight was born in Riverside and still lives there with her family. She's passionate about home in California, the Santa Ana River, the foothills and the deserts, and she's been writing about Southern California and the inland area for 40 years. From her kitchen window, she can see the hospital where she was born. And I understand that her daughters find this to be kind of hilarious. Most days she walks her dog Angel beside the Santa Ana River, a path she's followed since childhood, and then past the classrooms at Riverside Community College, where she wrote her first short story at the age of 16. In addition to In the Country of Women, she's published 8 novels and 2 books for children. Guess that's about to be 9 novels. Her short stories and essays have been published everywhere from The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and The Guardian, to Alta, The Believer, McSweeney's, Zoetrope, Reader's Digest, Real Simple, and Family Circle. She's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Lannan Prize for Fiction, a California Gold Medal for Fiction, and the Kirsch Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Los Angeles Times Book Prizes. You're going to have a wonderful time tonight at tonight's program with Susan Straight. Before we begin the program, I'd like to go over just a few quick housekeeping matters. Do you have the book? In the Country of Women is available to check out from all of our libraries here in Pasadena, or to purchase from Vroman's Bookstore. The library has the book available in ebook, e-audiobook, and print format. Tonight's program is just the premiere event in a month-long celebration of the novel. And we invite you to visit pasadenapubliclibrary.net to find out all of the other programs that will be offered throughout the month. We'll have book discussion programs, lectures, films, and much more. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed mayor, the Honorable Victor M. Gordo.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tim, for continuing together with the supporters this great tradition. You've done a great job of picking up the baton and helping our libraries through a very difficult time, and I congratulate you. Let me first welcome everyone to the 20th anniversary of One City, One Story. As we all know, Pasadena is a special place in many ways, but one way is we create traditions, and we celebrate traditions, and we celebrate them around education, around piquing people's interest in reading, in becoming better and more educated, and also in getting to know one another's stories. And that's what I particularly like about this book. Susan, it highlights the importance of telling and retelling stories. And I found those words in your book to be very compelling, very touching, and very important, an important reminder that not everyone's history is recorded in history books. Not everyone's history is remembered. And so it takes the telling and retelling of stories to really solidify our contributions as individuals and our contributions as a people to the great Southern California region and ultimately to the country that we live in. And so I applaud you for recognizing that. I applaud you for a tremendous book. And I thank you on behalf of all residents of Pasadena for bringing us this great work and reminding us of what really is important. And that's people's stories and celebrating people's lives and stories and contributions. And so I thank you. I look forward to listening. And I thank you for being a part of this great tradition that we're building in Pasadena 20 years now. So without further ado, we've already said lots about you. Tim's introduced you, and so I'll turn it over to you. Welcome to the great city of roses, and thank you for being here.
What a thrill. I love Pasadena, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I do have to say, of course, the first time meeting you, I'm like, thank goodness that there's no Dodgers on, right? If there were Dodgers on, I would feel really bad about making the mayor miss that, because as we were talking earlier, he's a big Dodger fan. And one of my favorite parts to write in this book was the section where my mom is learning to speak English from listening to Vin Scully do Dodger broadcasts. So it really makes me happy to see your next choice, your summer choice. I can't think of a better choice. I would start by saying that listening to introductions always makes me look down at my hands, and then I remember that I was nervous this morning, so before I went to work, I pulled a few weeds. And that's a very SoCal thing to do too right now in what we call winter, because I picked oranges for my neighbors, I pulled a few weeds, and I visited with all the people who walked by on the sidewalk before I went to work. What we're talking about with stories are those stories that do often remain untold. But what I want to start out by saying is I'm so grateful to everyone in the room here with me. The mayor, our lovely City of Pasadena library team, and also very much the technical crew that's helping us. I wish we could be in person. This is happening virtually for reasons that I understand better than anyone. My ex-husband, who is really the star of this memoir just survived COVID with the help of me and my daughters. And I take care of my 87-year-old mother, who's another star of the memoir. So I understand completely. But what an honor to be chosen for One City, One Story. I'd like to start out also by saying that the Pasadena, San Marino area has been like paradise to our family forever. I've written many times about my first visit to Pasadena. I was 12 years old, and a school bus brought gifted kids on a field trip from Riverside to the Huntington Library, where I fell in love with the paintings of John Constable, particularly the painting called The View on the River Stour. I think it's Stour, and I say Stour, and I'm never sure which one it is. He was painting his homeland in England. I was 12 years old when I saw that painting here in San Marino, Pasadena area. And I thought if I were to be a writer, I would write about the Santa Ana River and Mount Rubidoux and Big Bear and Lake Arrowhead and Mount Baldy, which we could see from my house with the snow. I'd also like to say hello in the audience to people who might be here from Pasadena City College, where I've given many talks. And, you know, Pasadena City College, like Riverside Community College, that's where a lot of us really begin our educational careers, especially if, like me, you're a child of immigrants. And my mom and dad weren't able to graduate from high school. I was the first in my family to graduate from high school, and I started going to Riverside City College when I was 16, and that is where I wrote my first short story, which was set in Idlewild and featured a dead body at the end of Herky Creek. It caused the professor to ask me whether everything was okay at home. My son-in-law graduated from Caltech, and Pasadena remains his favorite city, and my youngest daughter lives here now. So thank you so much. But a special thanks go not just to the Pasadena libraries, but all the libraries in the world that allow a kid like me, who didn't have any money, wasn't sure about whether I'd ever go to college, to think about story. And as the mayor said, to think about the stories that are not often told. Libraries are a huge focus of this memoir. My mom taught me to read when I was 3 years old, and she could afford one book. And the following week, she took me to the Riverside Public Library, and that really was the beginning of my writing career as well. And now to the book. I know that many people in the audience love to read, as do I, but I'm also going to be speaking to many of you in the audience who might be working on a book. You might be thinking about, well, how can I write a book? I find that the stories of our women all over America and all over the world are often the stories that remain secret. I loved writing about both my own ancestors and those of my marriage family. And those stories were so vivid, I had no trouble writing them down on yellow legal pads for all these years after hearing them and listening and trying to figure out the details. But the structure of a memoir is the hard part. And I wanted to say that for anyone in the audience who's thinking about writing, I realized that for this book, the Odyssey was a good journey to consider for the women in our family. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the prologue, which actually came very late in the writing. I had been writing already about the women in the family, but I hadn't figured out how to start it. I want to start out just by showing this picture. This is my mother-in-law, Alberta Marie Sims, and her sister Rosie. There is another woman in the picture that could be their sister Myrtle, and there's another woman who's torn out that could be their sister Mary. But this tiny little photograph in real life is only about 3 inches long, and it's clearly torn. And I found it in a baggie, a little sandwich Ziploc baggie that my father-in-law had put a piece of cardboard in. And I found it in a bin of photos and treasures and broken Christmas ornaments and candy after a roof leak at our house on Michael Street. And he gave it to someone to keep all those years ago. And so I looked back at that photograph many times when I was writing this prologue, and this is what I thought. To my daughters, they never tell us about the odysseys of women. They never say about a woman, her passage was worthy of Homer, her voyage a mythic quest for new lands. Women don't get the heroine's journey. Men are accorded the road and the sea and the asphalt, the monsters and the battles and the murders. Men get the Iliad and the Odyssey. They get Joseph Campbell. They get the 1,000 Faces of the Hero. They get the epic novel. and they get the Ken Burns documentaries. But our women, they fought harder than men. They fought men. They fought men who claimed to love them, to protect them, to help them, men who trapped and tried to kill them. Our women fought for sons and daughters, and they had the battalions of their sisters and mothers and aunts. They had some bad aunts with them. The women used their cunning and their bullets, the power of their ancestors and of the other women who were in the wagon or the truck or the car with them. Our women survived passages that would have made a lot of men quit. Sometimes the men did quit, and sometimes the women quit the men to stay alive. Our women might have wanted to return home, but they couldn't. They were not Odysseus, with rowers and soldiers returning after conquer and plunder. Our women had to travel to new worlds, pioneers and explorers, mythic as goddesses of war and love and intellect, because their old worlds were trying to kill them or starve them or bury them alive. Our women are not in history class or film or literature of the canon. Our women survived the men who survived the cannons of war, and those were some hard men. We hung out with hard men, with weak men and good men. We married them. Our women had babies, violence, guns, more babies, laundry, pots, but we had dancing, and we had secrets, and we had stories. We kept the nation alive. I wanted to start with that part because it is difficult when you're writing a novel. It's difficult when you're writing real stories. And when you're working on a memoir and you think, well, I have all these vivid stories, but how can I connect something together? And I often think about this when I talk to people around the country. And actually, I've spoken around the country, all over America about this book. I've been in Appalachia, where there are some great stories about moms and aunts. I've been in Louisiana, in New York. I've been to Washington, D.C., a place where people don't realize there are 7 and 8 generations of women telling stories. I've also spoken about this memoir in Turkey and heard astonishing stories about the legacy of how women came up in Turkey. I spoke about this in Guadalajara, Mexico, and heard many stories. And I find that no matter where I go, women always talk about how much of our histories are transmuted only between ourselves, other women. The way women tell each other stories in kitchens, in cars, in parks, in driveways, and definitely on porches. And that's a very SoCal thing, is to sit in the driveway with the Easy Up, and you have the Art LeBeau Killer Oldies, and everyone starts telling stories. That might be true for all of you or some of you listening. So I'm going to begin with Glendale. I've never talked about this before, but this seems a perfect place to begin with Glendale. Right around the corner from here. My great aunt Helen lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in Glendale. She never had any children, the only one of her 5 sisters that never had children. She was the youngest of the Triboulet sisters in this memoir. I met my great aunt Helen when I was 18. I was a freshman at USC. I started spending the night with her. She told me stories of my grandmother Ruby, who died long before I was born. The legend went that my grandfather caused my grandmother to die, but no one would talk to me about it until Aunt Helen. Ruby, her sisters, and their mother left Wisconsin for the prairies of Colorado, and then several of them came to California, to Echo Park, where many of them were devotees of Amy Semple McPherson. But the meeting of my grandparents was so shocking to me when I finally heard the story that I had to read this. Okay, is this better?
Do you want to switch? This microphone may be better.
Oh, it's okay. Is this close enough? I'm so short. This is the story that we all heard, that you 3 girls, my daughters, all saw in movies and on television, in songs, the fantasy and the marriage. I fell in love with her the first time I laid eyes on her. The minute I saw her, there could never be another woman for me. Just one look, that's all it took. I made sure no one else could have her. Now that sounds romantic, right? It's what we girls are given as true love, first sight and no other suitors. But when I finally heard the real story of how Ruby Triboulet, my grandmother, met Robert Strait, my grandfather, oh my goodness. I was 50 years old, the same age as she was when she died in Colorado. I had finally gone to visit my relatives in Nunn, Colorado, on the prairie flatlands near the borders of Wyoming, Kansas, and Nebraska, where the wind blows every day. And in the small front room of a tiny house, night fell with absolute darkness, as if a velvet blanket had been dropped from the sky onto the dirt roads of Nunn. There were only 300 people left in town. And Dale Barnaby, whose mother Vera was Ruby's sister, told me this story. They kept glancing around cautiously as if to make sure I was old enough to hear this. Their voices were rough and hesitant. They didn't even want to say my grandfather's name. Well, they said, it was right over there in Purcell at the schoolhouse. They had a dance, and 4 of the sisters went. And my grandmother's nephew Dale said to me, he had a gun. He moved his mouth from side to side looking at me, and then he said, Bob Strait. He had a gun in his coat. Toots, their other cousin, said, he seen Ruby right away and she was so little and pretty and she'd just gotten here from Illinois, where they were from. He went all around the dance floor, telling every man not to dance with her, and he opened his coat and shown them the gun. She was all alone all night and she was real sad. Not a single man asked her to dance. And then, on the last song, Robert Strait finally asked her and she danced with him, and after that, they had to get married. That story was terrifying to me. But that story is replicated all over the world. I had to have her, and if I had her, no one else would have her. I have to say that reading this, even aloud to you all, and thinking about what that meant it was in 1919, it sends shivers down my spine. Another story that I heard, not like that one, but equally terrifying, was told to me in a driveway, and that was the story of Daisy. And Daisy was Alberta, whose picture I showed you. This was Alberta's mother. Daisy Carter, her first husband, said, you're so fine, I just might have to kill you because someone might take you away from me, and I couldn't have that. Daisy Carter's mom had been killed when Daisy was only 5. And the reason I tell you this story is because my mother-in-law told it to me while we were sitting by the fire in the living room that was never empty while I was on my break from work. I came home to nurse my firstborn daughter. She must have been about 5 or 6 months old because she was old enough that my mother-in-law wanted to bite her little plump cheek. Alberta was watching the damp black curls of my daughter glistening with heat from the fireplace. And she said to me, my mother never had a home when she was little, not after her mother died. Alberta, my mother-in-law, paused. Her hands were so elegant, her nails strong and oval, her eyebrows vivid with pencil, her lips always defined with liner and lipstick. My mother-in-law, Alberta, said softly, they were walking down a road, her and her mother, Mary. She was holding her mother's hand. My grandmother saw the car coming, and she threw my mother out of the way, threw her up on the road bank where no one could see her, and then the car ran her over. The driver was a young white man with another young white male passenger, and the car plowed into Mary Thomas at great speed. The driver swerved back on the road and left her behind. And this part stays the same, no matter who tells the story, no matter how we write it. It was dusk, and suddenly a car was speeding down a narrow dirt lane, and Daisy Carter flew into the air, thrown there by her mother. And so when I began to write this book, I walked the hallways of my house at night, trying to imagine a 5-year-old girl flying through the air, seeing her mother lying there on a dirt road, and what she would have thought about her future. And Daisy Carter's future was that she became a matriarch of Riverside. She arrived here with 4 daughters, and she became what we called the Queen of the East Side. She was the style setter. She had a 2-story white Victorian house with an attic. And when that house seemed empty to her, she turned some of the rooms into boarding house rooms. And we tell stories about who arrived here from Georgia or from Texas. She was friends with Mrs. Bonds, and Mrs. Bonds' son was Bobby Bonds, the famous baseball player. So when you think about like how women controlled so much of the history of places like ours in Southern California, I find it fascinating that their stories aren't told more often until I remember that maybe it's so painful to tell the story of the beginning that you have to wait for the right moment. The last story I want to tell you is my little mother, who's 4'11". She was born in the land of Heidi, the Swiss Alps. When my mom talks about Heidi, she says, "Oh, Heidi had it good." Those of us who grew up reading books like Heidi, where Heidi was an orphan and her grandfather was mean, my mother says, "Oh, but Heidi always had food. She had cheese." My little mother learned to speak English by listening to Vin Scully's precise enunciation during Dodger broadcasts. When she arrived here from Switzerland, she had already run away from home. My mother's mother died when my mother was only 9 years old. In that little chalet in the Alps of Switzerland, she saw her mother's body laid out on a table. My mom was 9. Her little brothers were 4 and 3. And my grandfather, who had been a train conductor in Switzerland, married the young woman who was a nurse who had taken care of his wife while she died. So the grandmother that I knew was named Rosa Eyre. And here's what I thought you all would like to know. My grandmother is the one that made them leave Switzerland. My grandfather was 5'4" and never good at anything. He tried to have a farm and he failed. He got bored conducting trains. And he must have been the only man in Switzerland that did not like mountains. Like, what? That's not a thing. My grandfather felt hemmed in by the Swiss Alps. It was too beautiful. He decided they were going to go to the Congo or New Zealand. My grandmother talked him into Canada. She had a baby daughter, so soon the 4 children and the 2 adults took a boat and they left. Well, first they went from Switzerland to France, then they crossed to England. They took a boat from England and they landed in Canada. My mom picked strawberries and she picked corn, and at 15, she was not allowed to go to school. She was a farm worker, and her younger siblings were allowed to go to school. And she couldn't stand this. She thought she deserved better, and she ran away from home. My grandmother tried to marry my mother off to a pig farmer. My mother was 15. She packed all of her things in a little suitcase, and she went down the road and ran away. This is a story my children love to hear. When my mom got to the town, the nearest town, she worked as an au pair, and at night she worked in a diner. And across the river was a Ford and GM motor company. So she met men from Detroit as well as men from Oshawa, Canada. My mom was determined to speak perfect English, but she did not come to Fontana, California until she was 19. She wasn't willing to be reunited with her family until my grandmother, who by then was a head nurse at Kaiser Steel. Kaiser Fontana was the very first Kaiser Permanente HMO. When my grandmother died, by the way, she was the oldest living Kaiser patient in America. I think her Kaiser number was 600. I find that stunning. My mom arrived here at 19, and she refused to live in Fontana. She rented a little house she rented a room in a boarding house. And every night, someone stole her radio, her little transistor radio. There were 6 men in the house and my 19-year-old mother. She started sleeping with her radio under her pillow. Every night when she got home from her job, she listened to Vin Scully. Now that my mom is 87 and has severe memory loss, I'm going to tell you all a story that I've never told because I only heard it for the first time recently. When people have memory loss, they often think about their childhoods and they can't remember what happened 5 minutes ago, but they tell vivid stories about the past. My son-in-law Kumi was born in Ibadan, Nigeria, and for the last 6 months of COVID, my son-in-law, as well as my two daughters, my mother, and my ex-husband and I spent hours playing cards. During these card games, my mother would tell my son-in-law Kumi over and over a story that she had never told me. While I'm cooking, I can hear them. She tells him that when she lived in the tiny village of Burgestein in the Swiss Alps, there were 5 young men who lived in the attic of her schoolhouse. They were German soldiers who had fled the Nazi regime. They refused to fight, and they knew that if they returned over the border to Germany, they'd be tortured and killed. My mother tells my son-in-law that she remembers taking dinners from her mother's kitchen and walking into the schoolyard at night to feed the young men who could come out only at night to smoke and to play on the playground. The young men were teenagers. She tells him vivid stories about how the villagers hid these young men for more than a year, and that when the war was over, these young men disappeared into the Swiss countryside, and they must have married Swiss women. That is a story that I think of now forever as a product of COVID, a product of us all being together in my house at the kitchen table, and a product of listening. If I were to say something to those of you who are writers, it is that one of the greatest talents you have to be a great writer is to listen. People think that we are all about telling stories, but really, we listen first, and we try, actually the mayor and I were having this discussion, we try to think about how people talk. What if, as with many of my neighbors on my block, you speak Spanish and English fluently and in between? There's a beautiful language between Spanish and English, and it is American Spanish. And I love using words like that we think of in Riverside as words from my generation, which is ranfla and hoopty. If you drive a certain kind of car, it's a hoopty. And if you drive a certain kind of car, it's a ranfla. I would have to say, it's a hoopty. I would have to say that the joy for me in coming to speak to you all tonight is to think about how many of you might be in the next generation of writers. I wrote this memoir for my 3 daughters. They are the descendants of all these women that I've been reading to you about. They're the inheritors of the future. And my girls are so good at carrying these stories of the past with them. And now my sons-in-law are just that good. My daughters and sons-in-law sit in the driveway of Michael Street. Michael Street on Riverside's east side is where the locus of all these stories came. Now, with my ex-husband recovering from COVID, we walk in the foothills, we walk along the Santa Ana River, and we think about the fact that our girls are still hearing our stories and that it's up to us to tell the stories. But I know that it's up to me to write them down. My ex-husband, whom I met in the 8th grade, still talks about the 4 sisters. His Aunt Mary, his Aunt Rosie, his Aunt Myrtle, and his mother, Alberta, whose picture I showed you at the beginning. Alberta Sims died on February 15th, 1995, and I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, Rosette. She was born in August of that year. My youngest daughter carries her grandmother's beautiful winged eyebrows, which she sure didn't get from me, her love for shoes, her dimple, and my mother-in-law's love for narrative. Every week, my ex-husband and I might see 100 people that we've known since childhood. And the intertwined stories of our family are all of this California. Our stories are braided with Calexico, Mecca, San Bernardino, Riverside, Fontana, Los Angeles, yes, Pasadena, Glendale, Arcadia, all the way up to Oakland, Sacramento, Stockton, and San Francisco. This book
is about Californians. We are Californians deep in our blood, but we have African, Cherokee, Creek, Swiss, and French blood. And then we have the unknown, as almost every family has, especially if women were the backbone of the family. We are a nation of humans. Thank you so much for choosing this memoir for the One City, One Reads. I actually also want to say that I'm perfectly willing to answer questions about writing. And one of the hardest things to write a memoir, especially about women, but especially about women who grew up not having much money, who grew up poor, especially women who grew up during slavery, people who crossed borders like my mom, and my mom wasn't a citizen until I was 3. She wanted to vote for John F. Kennedy. That's why she became a citizen. Very handsome, she said, and she needed to be a citizen. To research those women, I do want to offer just a couple of tips. One thing that's really helpful, aside from Ancestry, because everyone looks at Ancestry, is if you're looking for a female ancestor, often census designations are difficult because women get married and they have different last names. Try looking in a city directory, like the city directory of Pasadena or Alhambra, or let's say you're from El Monte. Look up the city directory for El Monte for 1945, and you might be able to find your female ancestor there. Also, voting directories, which are hilarious. You can always say your grandma was a Democrat or Republican. They might be appalled. I found that those were much more helpful sometimes because our women didn't always get recorded as well by the census. The last thing I wanted to share with you is that I brought copies of my brand new book, Mecca. It comes out next Tuesday. And I guess I'm going to give all my first copies to everyone in here. But I'm also donating copies to all of our Pasadena libraries. This is Mecca, California. And there are stories in here about many of the same things we've been talking about, especially Mayor the Dodgers. The Dodgers are on the first page. I'm so happy again that I got to talk about writing. This way of thinking about our state, it all has roots in a place like Pasadena. In places like Fontana and Rialto and Riverside and San Bernardino, where people came from everywhere and considered this the promised land. And I wanted to close by saying, if we were to drive around, no matter where we were today, whether you're in West Virginia or Florida, Alabama or Idaho, whether you're in New Jersey or whether you're in Las Vegas, even if you're in Turkey, if you're in Switzerland, if you're in Mexico, what we have everywhere is somebody waiting to tell a story, especially a woman. So the last sort of piece of the puzzle is that all over the country, younger people have come up to me and said, after I read your book, I said to myself, the next time my aunt starts talking or my uncle starts talking or my grandma starts talking, instead of not listening and tuning them out, I'm going to listen to what they have to tell me because I bet they have a great story to tell. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, so much for your selections you read from us and your comments about it, too. I'll be the first to admit, after I read your book, I had a conversation with my mom right away and asked a lot of questions, and it was very inspiring.
I can't believe my mom tells stories now that I think she was afraid that we would be appalled by some of the violence or some of the scary things that happen. And so I think that is true. Like maybe to ask the right question is the hardest thing to do, isn't it?
Okay. Speaking of questions, I'll remind the audience at home, there is the ability to send us your question, and we'll try to share as many of them as we can with Susan. We'll get started with a few now. I've got to ask you about libraries because that's my career. You speak really affectionately about libraries being a lifeline in your childhood. Can you tell us more about why libraries are so important?
Oh, I think for me, the library, it's like, it was the very first time I ever went into the Riverside Public Library, which we didn't have a Carnegie library. We had this larger building. It just felt like home because one of my favorite things to write about is the book really opens with libraries. My mom was pregnant with my little brother, and my dad left. And I was 3 years old, and she would tell me this story. She said the only thing I wanted to do was read. And she, with her last quarter, she went to the Stater Brothers on Mission Boulevard in Rubidoux, because we lived in Rubidoux. We didn't even live in Riverside. We lived in Rubidoux. And she bought me one of those little golden books. The Pokey Little Puppy, I think, is the one. And she said that was my last quarter. I could never afford a book after that. But I knew that in America they had the library. And so she said, I took you the next week to the library. And she said, all you ever wanted to do was go to the library every day. To me, the library was this haven that I still feel exactly the same way. It's not the joke that, you can't be loud in the library. It's a cathedral of books. And I still go into every library, and I go to the children's room first. Like whatever city I'm in for my book tours, if I'm in Boston, if I'm in New York, if I'm in a small place, like I went into the library in Winterset, Iowa, and I just wanted to see what it was like in there. I was driving across the country. I go straight to the children's books, and I realized that all of our favorites are there. Anne of Green Gables, Betsy Tacy, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I just want to touch them and think that all these other little girls read these books and think it doesn't matter how poor I am. It doesn't matter if I don't have things. I can have this book for now. And that was a huge difference to me. So I write in the memoir, my mom said I could only check out a certain number of books. And I would try to check out 30 books a week. I would read them all the first day. So the bookmobile was my other shout out. The bookmobile was the big deal for me because once I was 9 and the bookmobile only came every 2 weeks, my mom was like, I'm not taking you to the library anymore. You can walk to the bookmobile. To get to the bookmobile, I had to climb 2 chain link fences, cross the railroad tracks, go through a ditch where drug dealers hung out, and then go through the Alpha Beta parking lot. My mom was like, you could bring some bread home on your way. We had so much freedom. The bookmobile was like a secret cave filled with adult mystery books. So I was 9 and I started reading Alfred Hitchcock. I started reading The Talented Mr. Ripley. It's quite terrifying. I think that's why I write such scary stuff.
That's awesome. So it's Women's History Month in March, and part of the celebration this month is honoring the courage of women throughout history. What's been the reaction from your readers to the courageous women in your family as they hear their stories?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. It's because my oldest daughter is a historian. She's getting a PhD in American Studies, and my middle daughter works with African American female photography and how it works in history, and my youngest daughter works. She works in the film industry, so she definitely has lots of feelings about women. We talk about this all the time. It's really, it's the women that we don't pay attention to me, that are the strongest. Everyone knows the famous women that we're taught over and over, right? But it really is your aunt that saved everybody. So I'm going to tell you a little story. There's an aunt in the book named Jenny, Aunt Jenny, that you remember. Aunt Jenny survived so much violence, and she ended up living on 21st and Central in South Los Angeles. And Aunt Jenny never had her own children because of the violence that had been done to her. But she raised her half-sister's children in Los Angeles, including my father-in-law. We went back to that house. All the uncles and my daughters were with us. And we stood at the gate, and this young woman came out. She's looking at us. Here's this big family, right? All these tall black men, and then me, and then my 3 daughters. And she says, can I help you? And we told her that we were there and she said, I know that this house used to belong to someone who had divided the attic into rooms. The woman who owned the house was from Mexico, and she was raising all of her nieces and nephews. And it was this, I'll never forget it. Those to me are the heroic women, the women who say, I will take on all these family members. I will provide a place for them. That's who we don't think about during Women's History Month. But it's really the woman, I met this woman at Grand Central Market in downtown LA. We went to help our daughter move, and we went to Grand Central Market, my ex-husband and me, and we needed just to eat something real quick. And I met this woman. It was a hot day. It was 105 that day. She was working behind the counter. And she said, Mija, my air conditioning broke. She said, it's hot back here. It's hotter at home. And I got 5 kids. And she said, I don't know what to do. And we started talking. And I just thought, oh my goodness, this woman, she was fascinating. That's a hero to me right there.
Thank you for retelling all the stories that you're hearing. You very generously said you wouldn't mind talking about writing, and I think you're right. I think we do have a lot of aspiring writers in the audience
That's
tonight.
great.
So can I ask you a couple of questions
Of
about
course. I'm so happy to hear that.
writing? Here's one that just came in tonight. I love this one. Do you take notes when you're listening to the family stories that you hear? How do you
Oh my
how do you
goodness.
hold on to those
That's
stories?
such an
Do you
amazing
record them?
question.
Yeah.
No one's ever asked me that. But you know what's funny? I just did a bunch of interviews for the new book with newspapers. And what people say to me is, well, how do you do your research? And I say, well, I don't do any research. I just sit in the driveway. The funny thing is now, when people are drinking a little bit, they'll be like, wait a minute, don't tell that story because she's here. I could never, ever get out a pad of paper and a pen in the driveway. No. And when I'm going to tell you a really, maybe this will be helpful. It's not even just about listening. It's about listening well. And what I do is, I learned this from being a mom, part of it. You know, you're home and I work and I have these 3 kids and I'm trying to cook dinner and wash dishes. And somebody's like, Mom, Mom, Mom. And I'd be like, what? Mom, on the playground? And I'm like, yeah. On the playground? Yeah. It takes a long time to tell a story. So you can't take notes, but you have to make sure that you ask the right question. Like, well, what did you think then? Or like, but what happened to her shoe? Or what kind of dog was it? And that's what helps you remember as well as helping the person tell the story. So I never, ever write anything down while I'm talking to someone because I'm listening, I'm looking at them. But I will tell you, I can write in the car. I wrote this piece for the LA Times years ago about writing. I can write a whole novel in my car. I wrote a lot of this novel in my car. I wrote a lot of this novel like in doctors' waiting offices with people who were sick, like my mom. I think the most important thing is to remember the details. And then when you get home that night, I do write everything on legal pads. It's all in the legal pads. And I write by hand first. And I write maybe the story of someone losing that dog. And like, what kind of dog was it? And people will tell you the story. And then you have to honor them by trying, if you're writing fiction, trying to get it right. If you're writing memoir, you have to make it as true as possible. So that's a great question. I think you have to remember by asking questions that'll help you remember when you get home.
I think in the 20-year history of One City, One Story, I think you are our first writer who is a professor, and as well as being the creator of the creative writing program at UC Riverside. How do you write and teach? When does it happen? Do you get up early in the morning? What's your process? Do you outline throughout the day?
It's going to be another appalling answer. For all those years, I actually started teaching at Inland Empire Job Corps. And I taught refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. I taught people who had dropped out of school in Mecca and Coachella and LA, Stockton, Oakland. I taught ESL and I taught GED. And I taught for 9 hours a day. And I was married young. I got married at 22. Dwayne worked nights at juvenile hall. So I worked all day and he worked at night and he took our only car. So I wrote at night. And I wrote on a trunk in a closet. We had a 1-bedroom apartment. I wrote on the trunk that Daisy Carter had brought with her from Mississippi. And like now, I hadn't even thought about that for a long time. To be writing on that trunk, like that was my desk in a closet. Boy, Daisy Carter's mom, she was definitely talking to me. So I wrote on a little Smith Corona blue typewriter. I couldn't figure out how to sell anything. I didn't know anything. But that was the beginning of me writing at night. So for all those years, I had 3 kids. I got divorced, but still saw my ex-husband all the time. I taught at UCR, and I tried to finish by 3 o'clock. Picked up my kids from school, had that second cup of tea. Everybody did their homework. They went to bed at 8.
And when we were married, he got up at 10 and went to work. And so I would stay up, I would wake him up, get him off to work at 11, and I could make it till 2 o'clock in the morning, and then I would get up at 6. So that's what I did. The funny thing was, when the kids grew up, the first couple months I was alone when my youngest one went off to college, I could not write in the daytime. I was like, daytime? What is this thing called daytime? I needed nighttime to be using my imagination. But now I can write whenever I can. I taught for 7 hours yesterday. I love teaching. I love teaching at UCR, my 33rd year. And so many of my former students, we've just been talking about Alex Espinosa, Michael Jaime Becerra, Keenan Norris, Rigoberto Gonzalez, Vanessa Hua. These are all published novelists, and it makes me very happy that we're all still in touch. And especially Alex Espinosa, who lives right here in El Sereno. Michael Jaime Becerra lives in El Monte. The three of us, that's my group. That's my people right there.
I've got one more question from a writer in the audience.
That's
I'll
great.
Because I think you'll like to hear from them. This person asked, when you've decided to tell someone's story, does it ever concern you that that the story may be maybe an embarrassing story to them or vulnerable? What do you do to get their permission to share that story if you think it's intensely personal?
Right.
Yeah.
It's the thing that's the hardest about memoir. So many people who teach memoir now say that there's this auto fiction that you can fictionalize a memoir, and it's a brick wall for me because I still live where I grew up. I'm gonna see people every day, so I would never ever write something that I felt was hurtful or damaging because I'm gonna see that person at Target tomorrow, or they're gonna come by the house the day after tomorrow. I spent so many hours talking to Dwayne, my ex-husband, about this, as well as all the uncles. And what everyone said is, but if you're the only writer, you're the only person in our whole community that's a writer. If you don't tell this story about Daisy or about Aunt Jenny, then no one will ever know that story. And so it was very difficult. Did I always put in all the terrible things? No, I did not. And the one thing that's the hardest is that my mom, because she has memory loss, has not been able to read this book. And she is such a big part. I see her almost every day. But really, her stories were great too. The story of running away, the story of learning to speak English. What happens now is that if you don't tell a story, we're back to the secret histories of women. It doesn't get told, but there are lots of things I didn't put in this book because there are lots of secret histories that we tell each other, especially on the porch or around the kitchen table, that could not make it into the book. So the two hardest was to talk about my grandmother, Ruby, that part that I read you. I read that on purpose because that was something I never knew. Those people are all gone now. And I thought it was really sad that I never got to know my grandmother because of that violence. So that was important for me to say that. But I tried to couch it. In a way that, think about what happens even now with violence. Think about young girls and think about social media and think about bullying. I guess I always want people to be able to tell the story, even if the story is scary. If you tell it to someone, you immediately feel better. That's why women tell each other stories. We're not always trying to solve something. We're trying to have company for the pain. So the company for the pain was the biggest thing that I've ended up talking about to everyone. We know we might not be able to solve the pain, but we just want some company to feel the pain. That's what women do. I'm sorry, but men try to fix it, and women are just like, let me just sit with you for a minute. So I think about it a lot for this questioner, is how to tell the story respectfully and how to tell it right. And I always go back and ask Uncle John, who lives in Fontana. I always go back and talk to my cousin Terry, our cousin KK, who lived in Las Vegas, passed away a month after the book came out. Those were the big storytellers in our family, and they're all like, no, you have to write it down.
It's beautifully said. Thank you. Our hour with you is winding down. I'm going to ask you one more question. Tell us something about Mecca, your book that's coming out on Tuesday.
Well, this is who I want to read Mecca right now, because we're up here talking about what is it like to navigate between languages. Briefly, I will tell you that the three main characters in Mecca, the main character Johnny Frias is somebody I think our audience is going to love, because there was a real, okay, I don't know if you guys, there was a real story. There was a freeway phantom of the 91 freeway. I don't know who in our audience will remember that. But in 1976 and 1977, if you were driving on the 91 through Riverside and to Corona and to Orange County, there was a guy that lived in the riverbed, and he would throw rocks at cars. And I mean, somebody died because a rock hit the windshield. So we were all terrified of the freeway phantom. And so I looked up the real story. I remember when he got caught. My character, Johnny Frias, is a California Highway Patrolman, and he is fifth generation Mexican American. So I was trying to write about this intersection for someone whose ancestors have been in California forever and ever, and came up during a time when all of a sudden somebody would come up to him and say, "Why don't you go back to Mexico?" And he's like, "Because I'm from Santa Ana." And to be a CHP officer was really hard. I have a friend named Louis Lozano who told me he's from Corona, and he really was the impetus. He told me many times about wanting to be a CHP officer and what it was like to grow up as a Mexican-American guy during that time. So the book has orange groves in the canyons off Yorba Linda and in the Chino Hills. But really the book is it's a lot about secrets. Again, there are two murders that take place. So Michael Connolly's been my big company in this book. He's been so helpful. And Alex Espinosa has been one of my other first readers. I'm trying to write about what it means to be something like the mayor and I were talking about. Like, you have a parent who comes from another country, and here you are, and here's the intersection of all these languages, and what does it mean to live in Southern California? And really the freeways are our rivers, right? So the funny thing about the book is it's all about it's on the 10, or it's on the 57, or it's on the 91. So you know how everyone hates us and says, "Oh my gosh, Californians, all you ever talk about is your freeways." Well, yeah, because everyone has to go to work, right? So navigating like our landscape is what, and the Mecca in the book is Mecca in Coachella. It's Mecca, California, which is where the beautiful date gardens are. So that's where the book is set.
Susan, our hour with you is winding down. Just want to let you know that everyone in the audience is writing in to thank you for your sensitive observations and writing about race in particular, and the experiences and the observations that you've shared. We are so grateful for this time with you and for the opportunity to read In the Country of Women. Anyone in the audience who has not read it yet, I hope your curiosity is piqued. You're really going to enjoy it. Check it out at the library or buy a copy at Vroman's. And for the program of events for the rest of the month, visit us on the website. That's PasadenaPublicLibrary.net. You'll see a month-long of programs that explore the themes and topics that Susan Straight writes about in her memoir.
You're especially going to enjoy Tracy Kahn talking about the history of citrus. I mean, really, when you think, like, my thinking is how many of our ancestors came here because they saw those postcards with snow on Mount Baldy and like the orange groves. That's why my grandmother came to become a nurse at Kaiser Steel. Wow. So I think it's beautiful programming that you all have. It's really impressive. Thank you so much.
Well, we hope to have author Susan Straight with us for a live in-person program with a real live audience in the near future, hopefully. But we thank you for being with us virtually today in Pasadena. Thanks for the visit.
Thanks so much for spending your evening with me.
And thank you. It's, as I'm listening to you, I'm connecting with, what you're describing as the strong women in my life as an immigrant. And I see the pain that they go through just to try and get the stories out. And so, congratulations for being able to draw out those stories and for understanding that there is a pain associated often with these stories. But there's also a healing, and I'm sure you've helped to heal quite a bit of that pain by encouraging people to tell their stories and reducing their stories to writing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope to see you guys again.